Before we begin, take a deep breath and gently close your eyes for a moment. Picture the mighty Roman Empire, the grand cities, the legions, the emperors who ruled the known world. Now imagine that empire falling. Its heart, Rome, fading into ruin. But what if I told you, Rome didn't die? Today, we're diving into the story of the Byzantine Empire. The Rome that refused to die. 1,000 years of forgotten glory, intrigue, faith, and brilliance that carried the torch of Rome long after the West had fallen. Sound of soft, ambient music, maybe a gentle distant bell or two, slowly fading in and out. Imagine a warm, cozy room, a flickering fireplace, and the subtle scent of old books. Hey there, night owls and history adventurers. Settle in, get comfy. Maybe you've got a cup of warm something beside you, or a favorite blanket wrapped just so. Tonight, we're going on a journey, not to a galaxy far, far away, but to a place equally wondrous, equally epic, and in some ways even more forgotten. We're going back in time over 1,000 years to explore an empire so grand, so enduring, it almost feels like a myth. Now, when I say Rome, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Togas? Gladiators? Maybe Julius Caesar looking very serious? You're probably picturing those famous ruins in Italy, right? The Colosseum, the Roman Forum, all that jazz. And you'd be absolutely right too. That was the mighty Roman Empire, the one everyone learns about in school, the one that gave us roads, laws, and some really dramatic stories. But here's the kicker. A little secret history doesn't always scream about from the rooftops. That wasn't the only Rome. Not by a long shot. Imagine, if you will, that the Roman Empire was like a giant, sprawling tree. For centuries, it grew and grew, its branches reaching across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. It was magnificent, truly, but like all old trees, it started to show its age. Cracks appeared, storms raged, and eventually one half of it, the western half, the bit with Rome, Italy, all the famous stuff, well, that part kind of withered. It didn't just fall with a crash, more like a slow, creaking decline. Then eventually, poof, done. Or so we're often told. But what if I told you there was another part of that tree? A massive, vibrant, incredibly strong branch that didn't just wither, it actually thrived. It kept growing, kept blooming, kept bearing fruit for another 1,000 years after its western sibling had pretty much turned to dust. This was the Eastern Roman Empire. And for reasons we'll get into, it decided to give itself a new, snazzier name, the Byzantine Empire. Still Rome, just a different, equally fabulous version. It's a strange thing, isn't it? We spend so much time learning about the rise and fall of Rome, but rarely do we hear the full 1,000-year saga of this other Rome, the one that refused to die. It's like finding out your favorite superhero actually had a secret twin sibling who kept saving the world for another millennia, but nobody ever mentioned them. Totally unfair, right? So, why is this forgotten glory so forgotten? Well, part of it is simply geography and language. The Western Roman Empire spoke Latin, which evolved into languages like French, Spanish, Italian, and even influenced English. So we naturally feel more connected to it. The Eastern Roman Empire, however, spoke Greek. And while they still called themselves Romans or Romeoi, as they said in Greek, the world outside started calling them Byzantines after their original city, Byzantium. It was a bit of a rebranding, maybe a little unwanted, but it stuck. Over time, as Western Europe rediscovered its own classical roots, they sometimes found this Greek-speaking Christian, but decidedly Eastern Rome a bit different, a bit alien. And so, its incredible story, its astonishing achievements, its endless drama, its magnificent art, and its fierce determination got tucked away in the dusty corners of history books. But not tonight. Tonight, we're dusting off those corners. We're going to step into the bustling markets of Constantinople, their dazzling capital city. A place that was, for centuries, the greatest city in the world. We'll meet emperors and empresses who were sometimes brilliant, sometimes bonkers, always unforgettable. We'll witness epic battles against overwhelming odds, where the fate of civilization hung by a thread. We'll explore stunning churches, unravel complex mysteries, and discover treasures beyond imagination. We'll see how this empire, which started as a desperate attempt to save a dying world, somehow managed to save itself, and in doing so, preserved ancient knowledge that eventually helped pull Europe out of its own dark ages. This isn't just a story of dusty old dates and names you can't pronounce. It's a story of human resilience, of faith, of ambition, of betrayal, and of breathtaking beauty. It's the tale of a vibrant culture that blended Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian spirituality into something truly unique and powerful. It's 1,000 years of whispers, now ready to be heard. So take a deep breath. Let your imagination stretch its wings. Close your eyes, if you like, and picture a city on the edge of 2 continents, its golden domes gleaming under the sun, its harbor filled with ships from every corner of the known world, its walls standing strong against every enemy imaginable. This is where our adventure begins. This is the echo of an empire's sunset that actually turned out to be a glorious sunrise, waiting for us to discover it. Are you ready to discover the Rome that truly refused to die? Good, because it's a story worth telling, and it's a story worth hearing. Let's begin. Last time, we talked about how the Roman Empire wasn't quite as fallen as some history books make it out to be. We hinted at a secret twin, a hidden chapter. Well, tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain and meet the person who essentially started this whole 1,000-year saga. A fellow named Constantine the Great. Now, imagine you're in charge of a massive, sprawling empire, the biggest one the world has ever seen up to that point. But this empire, the Roman Empire, by the late 3rd and early 4th centuries AD, was having a bit of a rough patch. And by rough patch, I mean it was basically a never-ending game of whack-a-mole with barbarians at the borders, too many emperors fighting each other like squabbling siblings, and a general feeling that things were just a bit chaotic. The old capital, Rome, glorious as it was, wasn't really at the center of where all the action was happening anymore. It was a bit too far west, a bit too exposed, and frankly, a bit too steeped in old traditions that weren't quite fitting the empire's new needs. Enter Constantine. This guy was a Roman general, one of several who were all vying for power in what's known as the Tetrarchy. Basically, rule by 4 emperors. Talk about too many cooks in the imperial kitchen. But Constantine was a smart cookie, and a seriously ambitious one. He had this famous moment, right before a big battle at the Milvian Bridge, where he supposedly saw a vision in the sky, either a cross of light or a symbol known as the Chiro, and heard a voice saying, "In hoc signo vinces," which means, "In this sign, you will conquer." He slapped that symbol on his soldiers' shields, went into battle, and won. Big time. This victory was a game changer, not just for Constantine, but for history itself. Because Constantine, true to his vision, became a big fan of Christianity. Before him, Christians were often persecuted, like a secret club meeting in basements. After him, well, let's just say their stock went way, way up. Constantine pretty much made it okay to be a Christian, and eventually it would become the official religion of the empire. This was a massive shift, shaping not just the Roman Empire, but pretty much all of European history that followed. So, Constantine wins, consolidates his power, and becomes the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. He's got a unified empire, a new favorite religion, but he's still got that old problem. Where should the heart of this new, revitalized empire beat? Rome itself was great for history, for tradition, but militarily and strategically? Not so much. It was vulnerable, and the real threats and opportunities were increasingly in the east. Think about it, trade routes, rich provinces, and that ever-present threat from the Persian Empire were all closer to the eastern Mediterranean. Constantine needed a new capital, a capital that wasn't bogged down by the ghosts of old pagan gods or the squabbles of old Roman families. A capital that could be a fresh start, a clean slate, a beacon for his new Christian empire. He reportedly considered a few spots, but then his eyes fell upon a little Greek city called Byzantium. Now, Byzantium itself wasn't much to look at back then. It was an ancient Greek trading post, strategically perched on a peninsula, surrounded by water on 3 sides. It had a fantastic harbor called the Golden Horn, which was naturally protected. It sat right at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the narrow straits that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. If you were playing a game of Empire Tycoon, this spot would be marked with flashing neon lights saying, "Prime real estate." Constantine, being the visionary he was, didn't just see a small town. He saw Nova Roma, New Rome. And he didn't just tinker with it. He rebuilt it almost from scratch on an epic scale. Imagine the biggest construction project you can think of, then multiply it by 10. He brought in architects, engineers, artists, and craftsmen from all over the empire. He commissioned massive public works. New city walls that were incredibly formidable, grand forums, imperial palaces so luxurious they'd make your jaw drop, public baths, aqueducts to bring in fresh water, and hippodrome, a massive arena for chariot races that makes the Colosseum look like a cozy backyard barbecue pit. He even looted statues and artwork from older cities to beautify his new creation. On May 11th, 330 AD, after years of intense work, Constantine dedicated his new capital. He officially called it Nova Roma, or New Rome. But, as often happens, people just started calling it Constantine's city. And in Greek, that translates to Constantinople. And so, Constantinople was born, a city destined to become the most magnificent, powerful, and culturally rich metropolis in the entire world for over 1,000 years. It wasn't just a physical new city, it was a symbolic one. It was Rome, reborn, but with a Christian soul and an Eastern focus. It was meant to be unconquerable, a shining example of imperial power and Christian piety. And for a very, very long time, it truly was. It stood as a bastion, guarding Europe against invaders from the East, preserving learning and culture when much of the West was descending into what we call the Dark Ages. It was like the empire decided, you know what? I'm not feeling Rome today. Let's try a different outfit, a different vibe, on a different peninsula. And boy, did it work. This new city, this new heart of the Roman Empire, wasn't just a place to live. It was a statement that Rome wasn't done yet, a statement that its legacy, its laws, its culture, and now its new faith would endure. It was the first act in our 1,000-year play, setting the stage for an empire that would surprise everyone by simply refusing to quit. So, as we leave Constantine gazing out over his magnificent new city, remember this: he didn't just move a capital. He planted a seed that would grow into the Byzantine Empire, a civilization that, despite being forgotten by many, played a pivotal role in shaping the world we know today. What happens next, after this grand opening act, is where the East and West truly start to walk different paths. And that, my friends, is a tale for our next gathering. We've just seen Constantine build his shiny new capital, Constantinople, essentially giving the Roman Empire a much-needed facelift and a new spiritual compass. He moved the heart of the empire to the east, a smart move for all the reasons we talked about. But here's where things get really interesting, and where our Rome that refused to die truly starts its own unique journey. Imagine the Roman Empire again, not as one solid thing, but as a really, really big house. For centuries, everyone lived under one roof, spoke more or less the same language. Latin was the official one, even if Greek was common in the East, and followed the same laws. But as we hinted, the house was just too big. It stretched from Scotland to Syria, from Spain to Egypt. Managing all that from a single spot, even a new one like Constantinople, was a logistical nightmare. It was like trying to organize a family reunion for several 100 million people across 3 continents. Someone's always going to feel left out or complain about the food. So, even before Constantine, emperors had tried dividing the empire up for administrative purposes, giving different guys control over different bits. It was a practical solution, like having regional managers for a giant corporation. But eventually, this practical solution became something much more permanent. The formal split happened in 395 AD, after the death of Emperor Theodosius I. His 2 sons, Arcadius and Honorius, each got a half. Arcadius got the east, with Constantinople as his capital, and Honorius got the west, with Ravenna, not Rome, interestingly, as his main seat. And this, my friends, was the moment the Roman Empire officially became 2 distinct entities: the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. It was like 2 siblings inheriting a massive, somewhat dilapidated mansion. They both loved the family name, they both treasured the old traditions, but they had very different ideas about how to run their halves of the estate. The western half, the one everyone usually thinks of, had a pretty rough time. It was constantly battling barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Huns, you name it, who were migrating and looking for new homes, or just looking to raid and cause trouble. The Western emperors were often weak, the economy was struggling, and the central government had less and less control over its vast territories. It was a slow, painful process, but basically the Western Roman Empire just couldn't keep it together. Its big cities got sacked, its borders crumbled, and its army was often made up of the very barbarians it was fighting. A bit ironic, right? Finally, in 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer basically said, "You know what? We don't need an emperor here anymore." He deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a young kid named Romulus Augustulus, whose name was, rather tragically, a tiny version of Rome's founder and first emperor. Odoacer didn't even bother to crown himself emperor. He just sent the imperial regalia, the fancy crown and robes, back to Constantinople, effectively saying, "You're the only emperor now, pal." And that, folks, is the traditional fall of the Western Roman Empire. It's a date that rings through history books, the end of an era. The lights went out on classical antiquity in the West. Or did they? This is where the Eastern Roman Empire, our Byzantine hero, steps into the spotlight with a smug look on its face. Like, ahem, excuse me, we're still here. While the West was collapsing like a poorly stacked Jenga tower, the East was not just surviving, it was thriving. Why the difference? Well, several reasons. First, geography. The East was richer, with fertile lands like Egypt and prosperous cities like Antioch and Alexandria. It controlled vital trade routes between East and West, meaning more money flowing into the imperial treasury. Constantinople itself was almost unconquerable, its formidable walls and strategic location acting like a super shield. Second, stability. While the West was in constant turmoil, the East generally had a more stable government and succession. Emperors might have been overthrown, but the imperial administration, the bureaucracy, was usually strong enough to keep things running. They had a much more organized and professional army, too. Third, culture and language. The East spoke Greek, which was the language of classical philosophy, science, and the New Testament. This helped foster a different kind of identity, blending Roman law and administration with Greek intellectual traditions and a deep commitment to Orthodox Christianity. They saw themselves as the true inheritors of Rome, the ones who kept the flame alive, even if they spoke a different language and had different ideas about bearded saints. They still called themselves Romans, remember? For them, 476 AD wasn't the end of Rome. It was just the end of Rome in the West. It was like a company shutting down its European branch, but keeping its highly successful Asian headquarters running full steam. The headquarters just became the whole company. So, while tales of barbarians sacking Rome are dramatic and often overshadow everything else, the real story for us is that a vibrant, resilient, and distinct Roman Empire continued on for another 1,000 years in the East. It weathered plagues, invasions, religious controversies, and internal squabbles, all while its Western counterpart was dissolving into a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms. The parting of the ways wasn't just geographical or political. It was also religious and cultural. Over time, the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East developed different interpretations of Christianity, different church practices, and even different political philosophies. These differences would eventually lead to a massive schism, a giant religious breakup, centuries down the line. But that's a story for another night. For now, just picture this. The lights going out in the West, chaos and confusion reigning. But across the Adriatic Sea, in the glittering city of Constantinople, the lights are still blazing. The markets are bustling, the scholars are studying, the emperors are plotting, and the city walls are standing firm. Rome, the idea, the legacy, the empire, was far from dead. It had just moved east, changed its accent a little, and decided to carry on the show with an even grander flourish. So, as the Western Roman Empire fades into the mists of legend, remember that our Byzantine Empire is just getting warmed up. It's ready to face its own set of incredible challenges and achieve even more astounding glories. And that, my friends, is exactly where we'll pick up next time. We witnessed the official split of the Roman Empire. The West went bye-bye, and the East, our Byzantine hero, said, "See ya!" and kept the party going in Constantinople. Now, it's the 6th century and the Byzantine Empire is standing strong, but it's about to enter one of its most exciting, and at times absolutely bonkers periods. And at the center of it all, a man named Justinian, Emperor Justinian I. If you ever meet a historical figure who seems to have had way too much coffee, it might be Justinian. This guy was a force of nature, an absolute workaholic. People called him the emperor who never slept. And frankly, I believe them. He was famously energetic, constantly working on laws, military plans, building projects, and religious debates. He was a brilliant administrator, a cunning politician, and, let's be honest, probably a bit of a control freak. He had a grand vision for his empire, a dream to bring back the good old days of Rome, the entire Roman Empire. Talk about ambition. But every great man, or in this case, incredibly busy man, often has an equally incredible partner by his side. And for Justinian, that partner was his empress, Theodora. Now, Theodora's story is straight out of a Hollywood movie, honestly. She wasn't born into royalty or even a fancy family. Her dad was a bear trainer at the Hippodrome. Yes, you heard that right, a bear trainer. Theodora herself was an actress, a performer, and by some accounts, a bit of a wild child in her youth. In Roman society back then, that wasn't exactly a straight path to the palace. However, Theodora was far more than just a performer. She was incredibly intelligent, sharp-witted, and had a will of steel. Justinian, who was captivated by her, not only married her, which caused a huge scandal among the stuffy old nobles, but made her his co-ruler, his equal partner in every sense. She didn't just sit there looking pretty. She advised him, she influenced policy, she met with foreign ambassadors, and she fought for women's rights, particularly for women who had been in her line of work. Imagine the eyebrows that must have been raised in the palace. But Justinian didn't care. He knew he had found someone truly extraordinary. Their partnership was put to the ultimate test early in Justinian's reign, during an event that almost ended his empire right then and there, the Nika riots. Picture this. It's 532 AD. The Hippodrome, that massive chariot racing arena, is packed. Chariot racing was the sport of the day, bigger than modern-day football or basketball combined. Fans were divided into rival factions, mainly the Blues and the Greens, and these factions were more than just sports clubs. They were like political parties, sometimes even street gangs. Well, some members of these factions got arrested after a race, and the crowd was not happy. They demanded the prisoners be pardoned. When Justinian refused, the crowds in the Hippodrome united. Instead of chanting "Go Blues" or "Go Greens," they started chanting Nika, which means conquer or victory, and they weren't chanting for a chariot. They were chanting for the emperor's head. The riots spilled out of the Hippodrome and engulfed Constantinople. For days, the city burned. Mobs ran wild, demanding Justinian fire his ministers and even abdicate. Justinian and his advisors were holed up in the palace, terrified. They were ready to pack their bags, sail away, and just give up. It looked like the end. But then Theodora stepped in. When everyone else was panicking and advising flight, she delivered one of the most famous speeches in history. She basically said, and I'm paraphrasing here with a bit of humor, "Look, guys, if you want to run, fine. The sea is there, the boats are ready. But me, I'm staying. Even if it means dying in purple robes. Being an emperor or empress is a beautiful shroud. I will not run. I will not live to be a fugitive. If you want to flee, flee. As for me, I will stay." Her words were like a splash of cold water to the face of the terrified men. Justinian, re-inspired by his wife's incredible courage, decided to fight. He sent his loyal general, Belisarius, and his troops into the Hippodrome, where many of the rioters had gathered. What followed was a brutal crackdown. Tens of thousands of rioters were killed, and the city was left devastated. But Justinian and Theodora survived. And not only survived, they came out stronger. The Nika riots purged many of the old, troublesome factions and gave Justinian the chance to rebuild parts of the city even grander than before. It showed everyone that the emperor and empress were not to be messed with. It solidified their power and cleared the path for Justinian to pursue his ambitious dreams for the empire. This was just the beginning of Justinian's incredible reign. With Theodora by his side, he was ready to tackle the enormous task of reuniting the Roman Empire, creating a new legal code, and building monuments that would awe the world for centuries. He really was an emperor who never slept, and with a partner like Theodora, he didn't need to. He had enough energy for two. So, as we leave the dust settling in Constantinople after the Nika riots, picture Justinian and Theodora, a formidable power couple, ready to take on the world. Their ambition was boundless, their courage proven, and their vision for Rome's future was about to unfold in truly spectacular fashion. And that, my friends, is exactly what we'll dive into next time. We saw how Theodora saved the day during the Nika riots, proving that sometimes the best advice comes from the person who isn't afraid to tell everyone they're being silly for wanting to run away. With their power solidified, Justinian was finally free to pursue his biggest, most ambitious dream, to bring back the entire Roman Empire. Now, remember how we talked about the Western Roman Empire falling in 476 AD? Well, for Justinian, that wasn't a fall. It was more like a temporary inconvenience. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was the rightful emperor of all Rome. His dream was Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire. It was a grand, almost crazy idea, considering the Western lands were now ruled by various Germanic kingdoms, often called barbarian kingdoms by the Byzantines. These guys weren't exactly lining up to hand back the keys to the empire. To achieve this enormous goal, Justinian needed a seriously good army and seriously brilliant generals. Luckily, he had both. His absolute star general was a guy named Belisarius. If you were casting a movie about this period, Belisarius would be the dashing, unflappable hero. He was incredibly skilled, loyal, and had a knack for winning battles even when outnumbered. Think of him as the Byzantine Empire's superstar general, their special ops guy before special ops was even a thing. He was the kind of general who could make his enemies say, "Oh, come on!" Justinian's first target for reconquest was North Africa, specifically the old Roman province of Africa, which was now ruled by the Vandals. The Vandals were, to put it mildly, not popular. They were Arian Christians, which was a different flavor of Christianity than what Justinian and the Byzantines followed, and they were known for their harsh rule and piracy. Plus, North Africa was the breadbasket of the empire, crucial for grain supply. In 533 AD, Justinian sent Belisarius with a relatively small but highly effective force to North Africa. It was a risky move, a long sea voyage into enemy territory. But Belisarius, being Belisarius, pulled it off. He landed his troops, marched towards the Vandal capital of Carthage, and in a series of swift, decisive battles, completely crushed the Vandal kingdom. It was astonishingly fast, like a lightning strike. Within a year, North Africa, a major chunk of the old Western Roman Empire, was back under Roman, or rather Byzantine control. Justinian must have been doing a happy dance in the palace. With North Africa secured, Justinian set his sights on the biggest prize, Italy. This was where Rome, the original Rome, was. Italy was ruled by the Ostrogoths, another Germanic kingdom. This was going to be a much tougher fight. The Ostrogoths were well established and had a strong army. So, in 535 AD, Belisarius was off again, leading the Byzantine forces into Italy. This wasn't going to be a quick campaign like North Africa. This was going to be a grinding, brutal war that lasted for almost 2 decades. It's known as the Gothic War, and it was devastating for Italy. Cities were besieged, battles were fought over every inch of ground, and the civilian population suffered terribly. Rome itself changed hands multiple times, besieged and damaged by both sides. Imagine the historic city of Rome, the heart of an ancient empire, becoming a battleground, its beautiful buildings scarred by war. Belisarius fought bravely and brilliantly, but even he couldn't do it alone. The Goths were tough, and the Byzantines often faced supply issues and sometimes even a lack of support from Constantinople, where Justinian was busy with other things, like building churches and writing laws, which we'll get to. Eventually, after years of grueling warfare and a lot of back and forth, another supergeneral stepped up, Narses. Narses was a eunuch, meaning he wasn't a typical military commander in the macho Roman sense, but he was a fantastic strategist and administrator. He finally delivered the knockout blow to the Ostrogoths in the 550s. Italy, too, was brought back into the imperial fold. Justinian didn't stop there. He also managed to grab a slice of southern Spain from the Visigoths. So, by the end of his reign, Justinian had managed to reclaim a significant portion of the old Western Roman Empire, North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. He had truly gone a long way towards Renovatio Imperii. He could honestly say he was the emperor of all the Romans, at least geographically. This was an incredible achievement, a true testament to Justinian's ambition and the skill of his generals. He had taken lands that had been lost to barbarian kingdoms for decades and brought them back under Roman rule. However, these reconquests came at a tremendous cost. The wars were incredibly expensive, draining the imperial treasury. They devastated the lands they were fought over, especially Italy, which took centuries to recover. And while Justinian might have reunited the empire on paper, it was a very fragile unity. The people in these newly conquered lands didn't always feel like true Romans anymore, having lived under different rulers for so long. The empire was now stretched thin, its resources strained, facing new threats on every border. So, while Justinian was basking in the glory of his reconquests, restoring the map to something closer to the old Roman Empire, he was also setting the stage for future challenges. He had achieved his dream, but dreams, especially really big ones, often come with a hefty price tag. As we leave Justinian celebrating his victories, imagine him standing on a map, meticulously coloring in the reclaimed territories. He truly believed he was restoring Rome to its rightful glory, and in many ways he did. But empire, as he would soon discover, is not just about drawing lines on a map. It's about people, resources, and the relentless march of new enemies. And the greatest of his achievements, and perhaps his greatest challenge, was yet to come. We just saw Emperor Justinian go on a conquering spree, reclaiming lost chunks of the Western Roman Empire with his superstar generals. He was a man with big dreams, and he certainly made some of them come true with steel and strategy. But Justinian wasn't just about battles and borders. Oh no, he was also a builder, a lawmaker, and a man obsessed with making his capital, Constantinople, truly shine as the greatest city in the world. Let's talk about building first. Remember those Nika riots we discussed, where half of Constantinople went up in flames? Well, Justinian, after surviving that fiery ordeal thanks to Theodora's courage, saw it not just as a disaster, but as an opportunity. You know what? He probably thought, sipping his morning espresso, if they had espresso back then. Since half the city is burned down anyway, let's build something really spectacular in its place. And boy, did he. He commissioned two brilliant architects, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, and gave them one simple, yet utterly mind-boggling instruction. Build a church unlike anything the world had ever seen. A church so grand, so beautiful, so awe-inspiring, it would make people think they'd stepped into heaven itself. And they delivered. The result was the Hagia Sophia, which means holy wisdom. If you've ever seen pictures of it, even today it's still incredible. But back then, it must have seemed like pure magic, a miracle of engineering. Imagine a massive dome, seemingly floating in the air, without any visible supports. The interior was covered in shimmering mosaics of gold and colored glass, reflecting light in a way that made the whole space glow. The sheer scale was breathtaking. It was the largest enclosed space in the world for over 1,000 years. When Justinian first walked into the completed Hagia Sophia, legend says he exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." He was comparing himself to King Solomon, who built the first temple in Jerusalem. That's some serious bragging rights, but honestly, looking at the Hagia Sophia, he probably earned them. It wasn't just a church. It was a symbol of Justinian's power, the empire's wealth, and the glory of God. It was the absolute heart and soul of Constantinople, and it truly lived up to its name, radiating a sense of profound, holy wisdom. It was like the city's proudest jewel, sparkling for all the world to see. But Justinian wasn't just building pretty churches, though the Hagia Sophia was way more than just pretty. He was also a legal eagle. For centuries, Roman law had grown, piece by piece, like a giant, messy pile of papers. Laws were scattered in thousands of books, often contradictory, and really hard for anyone to understand or use properly. It was a bureaucratic nightmare, like trying to find one specific instruction in a mountain of old tax forms. Justinian decided this wouldn't do. He wanted order, clarity, and consistency. So he put together a team of legal experts, led by his super-smart chief legal advisor, Tribonian. Their mission? To gather, sift through, organize, and clarify all of Roman law, from centuries of imperial decrees, senatorial acts, and legal commentaries. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, which basically means body of civil law. We usually just call it the Justinian Code. It wasn't just one book. It was a series of books, a massive undertaking. It clarified what the law was, simplified it, and made it usable. This wasn't just a tidy-up job. It was a foundational document that would impact legal systems for centuries, even up to today. Many of the legal concepts we take for granted in Western law have roots in Justinian's code. He basically gave the world the first real, organized legal system, setting a gold standard for how empires and countries should run their judicial affairs. It was a serious glow-up for law and order. Beyond the Hagia Sophia and the Code, Justinian also undertook numerous other public works. He built bridges, roads, aqueducts to keep that fresh water flowing to his huge city, and fortresses. He basically tried to modernize and secure every corner of his empire. He was constantly thinking, constantly planning, constantly building. Seriously, the man needed a nap. However, even for an emperor who never slept, there were limits. And sometimes fate has other plans. Towards the end of his reign, a truly horrific event struck the empire, the Plague of Justinian. This was a devastating outbreak of bubonic plague, the same terrifying disease that would return centuries later as the Black Death. The plague hit Constantinople especially hard, killing thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands. It decimated the population, emptied cities, and crippled the economy. It didn't just kill people. It killed soldiers, farmers, and artisans. It disrupted trade and made it incredibly difficult for the empire to recover. Justinian himself caught the plague, but he remarkably survived. Theodora, sadly, died a few years before the worst of the plague, possibly from cancer. The plague was a brutal reminder that even the most ambitious emperors, with the greatest generals and the grandest building projects, are ultimately at the mercy of forces beyond their control. It severely weakened the empire, making it harder to hold onto those newly reconquered territories in the west. It was a tragic end to an otherwise incredibly vibrant and transformative reign. So, as we reflect on Justinian's legacy, we see a man who truly pushed the boundaries of what an emperor could achieve. He reunited parts of the Roman Empire, built one of the world's most magnificent structures, and gave us the foundation of modern law. But he also left an empire exhausted by war and devastated by disease. He was a colossal figure, a true titan of Byzantine history, whose impact echoed for centuries. And his city of wonders stood as a testament to his vision, even as new challenges loomed on the horizon. We marveled at Justinian, the emperor who apparently ran on ambition and very little sleep. He built the breathtaking Hagia Sophia, gave us the super-organized Justinian Code, and even reconquered huge chunks of the old Western Roman Empire. Pretty impressive, right? But as his long and eventful reign wound down, and as the devastating plague of Justinian swept through the empire, it became clear that all that stretching and rebuilding had left the Byzantine Empire a bit, well, thin. And sometimes, when you're thin, you become a target. Justinian's successors inherited an empire that, while vast, was financially drained and demographically crippled by the plague. And guess who saw this as an excellent opportunity to cause some trouble? Their old frenemy, the Sassanid Persian Empire. Now, the Persians weren't just some random barbarians at the gate. They were a sophisticated, powerful, and very ancient empire, just as proud of their heritage as the Byzantines were of theirs. They were like the Byzantine Empire's arch-rival, the supervillain to their superhero, always duking it out for control of the Middle East. For centuries, these two empires had fought endless, exhausting wars along their shared border. It was like a never-ending boxing match, round after round, with no clear winner for ages. But this time, things got really bad. The early 7th century saw the Persian Emperor Khosrow II unleash an invasion on the Byzantine Empire that was absolutely brutal. They weren't just trying to grab a little bit of land. They were aiming for total domination. The Persians swept through the eastern provinces like a wildfire. They captured cities like Antioch and Damascus, which were vital Byzantine centers. They even managed to conquer Jerusalem, a holy city for both Christians and, of course, Jews and Muslims, though Islam hadn't quite arrived on the scene yet. And to add insult to injury, they captured the true cross, a relic believed to be the cross Jesus was crucified on. This was a massive blow to Byzantine morale and religious pride. It was a nightmare scenario for Constantinople. The empire was losing territory at an alarming rate, the treasury was empty, and it felt like the end was truly near. Imagine your country losing city after city, sacred sites falling to the enemy, and your government scrambling to figure out what to do. The Byzantines were in a panic. The Persian armies were literally at the gates of Constantinople at one point, with other enemies, the Avars and Slavs, also besieging the city from the European side. It was a proper doomsday situation, a two-front war against overwhelming odds. The empire was staring into the abyss. But just when things seemed utterly hopeless, a new emperor emerged, Heraclius. Heraclius was a general from North Africa who sailed to Constantinople and took the throne in 610 AD, just as the empire was on the brink of collapse. He wasn't exactly walking into an easy job. He inherited an empire that was bleeding, broke, and broken. Most people probably thought he was doomed, but Heraclius was a different kind of leader. He understood that this wasn't just another border skirmish. It was an existential fight for survival. He spent years reforming the army, reorganizing the empire's administration, and basically getting things back in order, even as the Persians were still running wild. He spoke Greek, not Latin, signaling a shift in the empire's identity, even as he sought to preserve its Roman roots. Then, in a move that was incredibly bold and utterly genius, Heraclius decided to take the fight directly to the enemy. Instead of defending every last inch of Byzantine territory, he decided to launch a counterattack deep into Persian territory. It was like saying, "You want to play rough? Fine. I'm coming to your house." He personally led his armies, often carrying a holy icon, turning the war into something like a holy crusade for the survival of Christendom. He campaigned tirelessly for years, leading his troops through mountains, deserts, and harsh winters. He fought battle after battle, pushing the Persians back, liberating the captured cities, and finally, in 627 AD, he delivered a crushing defeat to the Sassanid Persian army at the Battle of Nineveh. This was a decisive victory, a true turning point. Heraclius then marched deep into the heart of Persia, forcing them to sue for peace. The terms were simple: give back all the conquered Byzantine territory, release all prisoners, and most importantly, return the true cross to Jerusalem. Heraclius himself made a triumphant pilgrimage to Jerusalem, personally carrying the recovered true cross back into the city. It was an absolutely epic moment, a massive victory after decades of despair. He had saved the empire from utter destruction. He was hailed as a hero, a savior, a second Constantine. The Byzantine Empire had pulled itself back from the brink, against all odds. Heraclius's victory was a stunning achievement, arguably one of the greatest comebacks in military history. He had faced down the mighty Persian Empire and emerged victorious, seemingly securing the future of the Byzantine Empire. However, as is often the case in history, no victory is ever truly final. Both the Byzantine and Persian empires were utterly exhausted by these decades of brutal warfare. They were like two boxers who had just fought 15 rounds, both barely standing, completely drained. Little did they know that a brand new, incredibly powerful force was about to emerge from the deserts of Arabia, a force that would change the world forever and put both empires to an even greater test. And that, my friends, is a story for our next chapter. We left Emperor Heraclius basking in the glow of his incredible victory over the Sassanid Persians. He had saved the Byzantine Empire from certain doom, brought back the true cross, and everyone was probably breathing a huge sigh of relief, thinking, "Phew, crisis averted." Now we can finally get some rest. Oh, how wrong they were. History, as it often does, had a massive surprise just around the corner. One that would completely reshape the world and throw the exhausted Byzantine Empire into its greatest struggle yet. From the deserts of Arabia, a new power was emerging, driven by a new faith, Islam. Prophet Muhammad had founded Islam, uniting the Arab tribes under a single god, Allah. After his death in 632 AD, his followers, led by a series of caliphs, began a period of incredibly rapid expansion. And by rapid, I mean lightning fast, mind-bogglingly swift. It was like someone hit the fast-forward button on empire building. The Byzantine and Persian empires, remember, had just finished pummeling each other into exhaustion. They were like two prize fighters who had gone 15 rounds, both barely standing, utterly drained, and now a fresh, incredibly energetic and highly motivated third fighter just leaped into the ring. You can imagine how that went for the exhausted empires. The Arab armies, fueled by their new faith and a fierce sense of unity, swept out of Arabia with astonishing speed and success. And their first big targets? The wealthy, weakened provinces of the Byzantine Empire in the Middle East. Within just a few decades, starting from the 630s, the Byzantines lost huge chunks of territory. Egypt, the empire's vital breadbasket, fell. Syria, with its ancient cities like Damascus and Antioch, was lost. Palestine, including Jerusalem, was conquered. North Africa, which Justinian had fought so hard to reclaim, began to slip away. It was a dizzying, terrifying period for the Byzantines. Emperor Heraclius, who had just been the savior of the empire, watched helplessly as many of the lands he had fought to protect, or even just regained from the Persians, were lost again, this time to an even more relentless enemy. It must have been incredibly disheartening. It wasn't that the Byzantine armies didn't fight. They fought bravely, but they were often outnumbered, exhausted, and caught off guard by the speed and fervor of the Arab advance. This wasn't just a border skirmish. It was a fundamental shift in world power. But the ultimate goal of the expanding caliphate was clear: Constantinople. The dazzling capital, the queen of cities, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. If they could take Constantinople, it would be the ultimate prize, a symbolic victory that would announce their dominance to the entire world. And so, the great sieges began. The Arab armies launched multiple attacks on Constantinople, but two stand out as truly epic. The first was from 674 to 678 AD. The Arab fleet sailed right up to the city walls, launching continuous assaults by land and sea. Imagine being inside those walls, seeing enemy ships fill the horizon, hearing the constant clang of battle, knowing that if the walls fell, it was all over. What saved Constantinople, besides its absolutely massive and ingenious triple line of walls, was a secret weapon: Greek fire. This stuff was like ancient napalm, a highly flammable liquid that could be shot through siphons like flamethrowers onto enemy ships. It was terrifyingly effective because it reportedly burned even on water. The Byzantines kept its formula a closely guarded secret, giving them a huge advantage in naval warfare. It was like they had invented their own superhero power. The first siege failed. The Byzantines, with their walls and Greek fire, held firm, eventually pushing the Arabs back. But the Arabs weren't deterred for long. They regrouped, rebuilt their forces, and launched an even bigger, more determined siege from 717 to 718 AD. This was an absolutely colossal effort, possibly the largest siege in ancient and medieval history. Tens of thousands of soldiers and a massive fleet blockaded Constantinople by land and sea. The city was completely cut off. Inside the walls, Emperor Leo III, a very capable military leader, rallied the people. They endured a brutal winter, suffering from starvation and disease. But the walls held. Greek fire once again devastated the Arab fleet. And as the siege dragged on, an unexpected ally appeared. The Bulgars, a powerful Turkic people from the north, attacked the Arab forces from the rear, adding to their misery. Eventually, after a year of relentless struggle, the caliphate was forced to admit defeat. The Arab armies, decimated by battle, disease, starvation, and the Byzantine defenses, retreated. Constantinople had held. Again, these sieges were more than just military victories. They were watershed moments in history. If Constantinople had fallen to the caliphate in the 7th or 8th century, the course of European history would have been entirely different. Much of Europe was still relatively undeveloped, the Dark Ages in full swing in the West. Constantinople acted as a shield, protecting Christian Europe from further Islamic expansion into the continent at that time. It preserved classical learning, Roman law, and Christian culture for centuries. So, while the Byzantine Empire lost vast territories in the east to the powerful new Islamic caliphates, the heart of the empire, Constantinople, remained unconquered. It was a massive defeat in terms of land, but an even greater victory in terms of sheer survival. The walls of Constantinople didn't just protect a city, they protected a civilization. And that, my friends, is a pretty big deal. We saw Constantinople stand strong against the terrifying tide of the expanding Islamic caliphate, thanks to its super tough walls and a little something called Greek fire. The empire lost a lot of land, but it survived. Phew, you'd think after all that external drama, everyone would be ready for a nice, quiet break, right? Nope. This is the Byzantine Empire we're talking about, and they always found a way to make things interesting, even if it meant arguing passionately amongst themselves. And what did they argue about? Well, believe it or not, they had a massive, empire-shaking, century-long argument about religious pictures. Yes, images, icons, little paintings or mosaics of Jesus, Mary, and the saints. This massive debate is known as the iconoclastic controversy, and it was anything but little. Now, to understand this, you have to remember how important faith was in the Byzantine Empire. It wasn't just a part of life. It was life. Religion was everywhere, shaping everything from politics to art to daily routines. So, icons, those religious images, were a really big deal. People used them in churches, in their homes, even carried them into battle. They believed these icons weren't just paintings, but windows to the divine, helping them connect with God and the saints. They'd light candles in front of them, kiss them, pray to them. But then some people started to get worried. They looked at all this devotion to images and thought, is this getting a bit too much? Are we, dare I say it, worshiping the images themselves instead of what they represent? Isn't that a bit like idol worship, which the Bible is pretty clear about being a no-no? This was the fear that veneration, respectful devotion, was slipping into idolatry, worshiping idols. This concern gained a lot of traction, especially in the eastern parts of the empire, closer to where Islam had recently risen. Islam, of course, is very strict about not depicting God or prophets in images to avoid idolatry. So, there might have been some influence there, or at least a questioning. The movement to destroy icons, or at least get rid of them from churches, was called iconoclasm, which literally means image breaking. And it wasn't just a few people grumbling. This became official imperial policy. It all kicked off seriously in 726 AD, under Emperor Leo III, yes, the same guy who famously defended Constantinople from the Great Arab Siege. He started issuing decrees against icons, ordering their removal and destruction. Imagine going into your church one day and seeing soldiers taking down all the beautiful mosaics and paintings. People were not happy, like really not happy. The emperors who followed Leo III, like Constantine V, were even more hardcore iconoclasts. They believed it was their duty to cleanse the empire of what they saw as idolatry. They held councils, tried to enforce their views, and sometimes even persecuted those who dared to defend icons. Monks, in particular, were big defenders of icons, seeing them as essential to their faith and spiritual life. So, you had emperors, who were usually seen as God's representatives on earth, clashing directly with monks and a huge chunk of the ordinary people. It was a proper theological and political showdown. Think of it as a massive culture war, but instead of arguing about movies or music, they were arguing about religious art. On one side, you had the iconoclasts, who believed icons were a dangerous distraction, perhaps even blasphemous. On the other side were the iconodules, meaning venerators of icons, who argued that images of Christ and the saints were important for teaching the faith, helping people pray, and that true worship was directed at God through the image, not to the image itself. They pointed out that if Jesus truly became human, then he could be depicted. This controversy wasn't just a quiet theological debate. It got super messy. Icons were smashed, whitewashed, or defaced. People rioted in the streets. There were public debates, arrests, and even executions. Scholars argued back and forth, writing mountains of text trying to prove their side was right. It really was a battle for the soul of the Byzantine Empire. The impact on art and culture was huge, obviously. During the periods of iconoclasm, artistic expression shifted away from depicting figures and focused more on crosses, abstract patterns, and nature scenes. Many beautiful, ancient icons and mosaics were lost forever, smashed by zealous iconoclasts. It's a tragic loss for art history. This went on, off and on, for over a century. Imagine a government policy that lasted for more than 100 years, with different emperors trying to enforce it or roll it back. It truly divided the empire, causing a lot of internal strife and making everyone a bit stressed out. Finally, the tide turned back towards the iconodules. In 843 AD, Empress Theodora, a different Theodora from Justinian's wife, just to keep things confusing, who was ruling as regent for her young son Michael III, decided enough was enough. She was an iconodule herself and recognized that the controversy was tearing the empire apart and wasn't winning anyone any favors. She convened a council that formally reaffirmed the veneration of icons. This event is known as the Triumph of Orthodoxy and is still celebrated by the Eastern Orthodox Church today. Icons were brought back into the churches, and the period of iconoclasm officially ended. It was a massive victory for religious art and for a particular understanding of Christian theology. So, the Byzantine Empire, after surviving external threats, now survived a century-long internal theological brawl over religious pictures. It shows just how deeply religious faith was ingrained in every aspect of Byzantine life. They fought over doctrines and images with as much fervor as they fought over territory. And in the end, the beautiful shimmering icons, those windows to the divine, returned to their rightful place in the churches and homes of the Byzantine people. As the echoes of the iconoclastic debates finally die down, the Byzantine Empire emerges, battered but perhaps even stronger in its religious identity, ready for a new era of growth and glory. And that, my friends, is exactly where our story will take us next time. We navigated the wild, century-long debate about religious pictures, the iconoclastic controversy, and saw the triumph of orthodoxy bring icons back to their rightful place in Byzantine churches. The empire had survived external invasions and internal theological squabbles. It was like finally clearing out the dusty attic and feeling ready for a fresh start. And indeed, the Byzantine Empire was about to enter another one of its most glorious periods, the Macedonian Renaissance. This new era kicked off with a new ruling family, the Macedonian dynasty. Now, don't let the name fool you into thinking they were from ancient Macedon, like Alexander the Great. They weren't. The first emperor of this dynasty, Basil I, was actually of Armenian descent, though he identified with the region of Macedonia. He had a pretty dramatic rise to power, starting as a peasant, becoming a stable master, then charming his way into imperial circles, and eventually, well, arranging for the previous emperor to be removed. Let's just say Byzantine politics were rarely dull, and often involved a bit of palace intrigue and cloak and dagger stuff. Basil I was a self-made man who grabbed the throne and then proved himself surprisingly capable. What followed from the late 9th century through the 11th century was a period of incredible resurgence for the Byzantine Empire. It was like the empire took a deep breath, remembered how awesome it was, and decided to flex its muscles again. This wasn't just a recovery. It was a renaissance, a rebirth of strength, culture, and prosperity. First off, let's talk military. After all those centuries of defending against the Persians and the Arabs, the Byzantines got really good at warfare. The Macedonian emperors were often strong military leaders themselves, or they appointed brilliant generals. They weren't just hunkering down behind their walls anymore. They were going on the offensive. They started pushing back against their enemies on multiple fronts. In the east, they slowly but surely began to reclaim territories they had lost to the Arab Caliphate centuries earlier. It was a slow grind, but they were taking back cities, fortresses, and land in places like Syria and Mesopotamia. Imagine those old Roman borders creeping back inch by inch on the map. They were showing the world that the Rome that refused to die wasn't just surviving. It was actively expanding again. But the most famous and impactful military campaigns of this era were against a new and powerful enemy in the Balkans, the Bulgarian Empire. These guys were a formidable foe, a big, strong kingdom to the north of Byzantium, constantly raiding and causing trouble. The wars between the Byzantines and the Bulgarians were long, brutal, and utterly exhausting for both sides. We'll get into the details of one of the most famous emperors who dealt with them next time. But for now, just know that the Byzantine army was back in fighting shape, disciplined, and effective. Beyond military might, this was also a time of incredible cultural flourishing. Imagine a golden age where art, literature, and scholarship truly blossomed. After the iconoclastic controversy, religious art came back with a vengeance, but with new styles and incredible skill. Mosaics became even more stunning. Churches were decorated with breathtaking frescoes and illuminated manuscripts. Beautifully handwritten and illustrated books were produced. The imperial court in Constantinople was a center of luxury and sophistication, influencing art and fashion across Europe and the Middle East. Scholars were busy too. There was a renewed interest in classical Greek learning, philosophy, science, and history. Libraries were expanded, ancient texts were copied and studied, and new works of history, theology, and poetry were written. This preservation of classical knowledge was incredibly important, especially as much of this learning was still lost or forgotten in Western Europe. The Byzantines were basically keeping the lamp of ancient knowledge lit while others were still fumbling in the dark. Economically, the empire was thriving. Constantinople was still the undisputed commercial hub of the world, a bustling metropolis where goods from China, India, Russia, and Western Europe were traded. Its currency, the nomisma, a golden coin, was stable and respected everywhere, the dollar of its day. The empire had a sophisticated bureaucracy and tax system that helped keep the money flowing, allowing for all these military campaigns and grand building projects. It was a period of general prosperity, a time when the average Byzantine might have felt a bit more secure and proud of their powerful, cultured empire. So, the Macedonian dynasty truly marked a period of rebirth and renewed glory for the Byzantine Empire. They were strong militarily, rich economically, and vibrant culturally. They were showing the world that they were still the Roman Empire, just a more Eastern, Greek-speaking, and Christian version of it, and a seriously impressive one at that. As we picture the glittering courts of Constantinople, filled with scholars, artists, and powerful emperors, remember that this was a dynasty that pulled the empire up, dusted it off, and set it on a course for renewed greatness. But even in a golden age, challenges always loom, and the greatest military leader of this period was about to face one of Byzantium's fiercest enemies head-on. And that, my friends, is a story you won't want to miss next time. We explored the Macedonian Renaissance, a period where the Byzantine Empire got its groove back, stronger armies, more money, and a vibrant cultural scene. The empire was feeling pretty good about itself, but there was one particular thorn in its side, a constant nuisance that had grown into a major threat, the Bulgarian Empire. And standing ready to deal with this threat was one of Byzantium's most legendary, and perhaps most brutal emperors, Basil II. If Justinian was the emperor who never slept, Basil II was the emperor who never stopped fighting. He wasn't a man known for his charm or his grand building projects. He was a soldier emperor, through and through. He came to the throne as a young man, initially sharing power, but eventually taking full control and ruling with an iron fist. He was disciplined, hardworking, and absolutely ruthless when it came to his enemies. He was less about fancy parties and more about getting the job done, no matter how tough. The Bulgarian Empire, remember, was a powerful kingdom located to the north of the Byzantines, in the Balkan region. They had been a thorn in Byzantium's side for centuries, constantly raiding, expanding, and at times, even threatening Constantinople itself. By the time Basil II came to power, the Bulgarian Empire was led by a formidable ruler named Samuel, who had consolidated Bulgarian power and was a real challenge to Byzantine supremacy in the Balkans. It was like two heavyweight champions circling each other in the ring, waiting for the decisive fight. Basil II decided enough was enough. He considered the reconquest of Bulgaria his life's mission. He wasn't going to let this rival empire sit on his doorstep anymore. And so began a long, arduous, and incredibly brutal series of wars that lasted for decades. Nearly 40 years of continuous campaigning. This wasn't a quick sprint. It was a marathon of military might and sheer endurance. Basil II personally led his armies year after year, campaigning every summer, enduring harsh conditions, and always pushing his troops. He was a master of strategy, using combined arms tactics, sieges, and clever maneuvers to slowly wear down the Bulgarian resistance. He wasn't just directing from the palace. He was out there on horseback with his soldiers. He earned their respect, but also instilled a healthy dose of fear in his enemies. The wars with Bulgaria were characterized by their intensity and the grim determination of both sides. There were sieges, ambushes, pitched battles, and scorched earth tactics. It was a war of attrition, with neither side willing to give up. The Bulgarians, under Samuel, fought just as fiercely, proving to be a truly tenacious foe. The decisive moment came in 1014 AD at the Battle of Clydion, also known as the Battle of the Clydon Pass. Basil II managed to trap and completely encircle the main Bulgarian army in a narrow mountain pass. The Byzantine forces then attacked, inflicting a catastrophic defeat on the Bulgarians. It was a crushing blow, virtually annihilating Samuel's army. But what happened after the battle is what truly earned Basil II his chilling nickname, the Bulgar Slayer. Legend has it, and historians largely agree, that he captured around 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners. Instead of executing them all or ransoming them, Basil II ordered that they all be blinded. All of them, except for every 100th man, who was left with one eye, so he could lead the others home. Imagine that sight. 15,000 blinded men, stumbling back to their homeland, led by a small number of one-eyed guides. When Tsar Samuel saw his army return in such a horrific state, the shock was so great that he supposedly died 2 days later. It was an act of brutal psychological warfare, meant to break the spirit of the Bulgarians completely and prevent any future resistance. And it worked. After Clydion, it took Basil II a few more years to fully conquer the remaining Bulgarian strongholds, but the back of the Bulgarian Empire was broken. By 1018 AD, the entire Bulgarian Empire was absorbed into the Byzantine Empire. Basil II was at the absolute peak of his power. With Bulgaria conquered, the Byzantine Empire reached its greatest territorial extent since the time of Justinian, centuries earlier. It stretched from southern Italy across the Balkans through Asia Minor and down into parts of Syria and Mesopotamia. Constantinople was truly the heart of a vast and powerful empire once again. Basil II had secured the Balkans, provided a period of peace and stability, and ensured the flow of tax revenues into the imperial treasury. He ruled like an absolute monarch, keeping the nobility in check and maintaining a strong central government. Basil II was not a lovable figure, and his methods were certainly harsh, but his effectiveness as a ruler and a military commander is undeniable. He secured Byzantium's borders, brought immense prestige to the empire, and ensured its continued dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. He was a ruthless pragmatist, focusing entirely on the strength and security of his empire. As we picture Basil II, a stern, unsmiling figure, riding through his newly conquered territories, we see an emperor who truly lived up to the Roman ideal of virtus, courage, and excellence. He was the Bulgar Slayer, the warrior emperor who brought the Byzantine Empire to its zenith of power. But as with all peaks, a descent often follows. And the world was changing, with new religious and political fault lines about to become even more pronounced. And that, my friends, is exactly what we'll explore next time. We witnessed the awe-inspiring, if somewhat terrifying, military might of Basil II, the Bulgar Slayer, who brought the Byzantine Empire to its greatest height since Justinian. The empire was strong, secure, and glorious, stretching across vast lands. You'd think with all that external success, things would be perfectly harmonious, right? Well, not quite. While Basil II was busy conquering enemies, another, much quieter, but ultimately more profound split was happening, not of land, but of faith. We've talked about how the Roman Empire officially divided into East and West back in 395 AD. And we've seen how the western half eventually crumbled, while the eastern half, our Byzantium, thrived. But even though they both called themselves Roman and both worshiped Jesus, these two have started to grow apart culturally, politically, and most importantly, religiously. It was like two siblings who started with the same toys and games, but over centuries, developed totally different interests and ways of seeing the world. Let's tick off some of the differences that grew over time. Language. In the West, they mostly spoke Latin. In the East, they spoke Greek. This might seem small, but imagine trying to discuss deep theological ideas when you're literally using different words for the same concepts. Things get lost in translation, or sometimes new meanings emerge. Politics. The West had various Germanic kingdoms and eventually the rise of the Pope as a powerful political and spiritual figure. The East had a single, powerful emperor in Constantinople who was seen as God's representative on earth, deeply involved in church affairs. The Pope in Rome saw himself as the head of all Christians, including those in the East. The Byzantine Patriarch of Constantinople, the head of the church in the East, wasn't so keen on that idea. He saw himself as equal to the Pope, or at least independent. It was a classic "who's the boss?" argument, but with religious consequences. Culture. Western culture was more influenced by Germanic traditions blending with Roman ones. Eastern culture was a rich mix of Greek, Roman, and Middle Eastern influences, with a strong emphasis on philosophical and theological precision. But the biggest, most crucial difference that finally pushed them over the edge was a theological one, specifically involving a tiny three-letter word in the Nicene Creed, a fundamental statement of Christian belief. This word was filioque. Now, stick with me here because this might sound like a super nerdy theological debate, but it had huge implications. The original Nicene Creed, agreed upon by early church councils, stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. Simple enough. But in the West, over time, they added the word filioque, making it read that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. The Byzantines, the East, absolutely hated this addition. They argued that it changed a fundamental doctrine of Christianity, that it was added without the consent of all the patriarchs, the heads of the major Christian centers, and that it undermined the unique role of God the Father as the single source of the Trinity. It was like someone scribbling an extra sentence into a universally agreed-upon constitution without telling everyone else. The West said, "It clarifies things." The East said, "You changed the rules." This filioque clause became a massive point of contention, a symbol of the growing distrust and differing theological approaches. So you had centuries of these little differences adding up, like tiny cracks appearing in a dam. Misunderstandings, accusations, and power plays mounted. Finally, in 1054 AD, those cracks turned into a full-blown rupture. The Pope in Rome, Leo IX, sent a cardinal named Humbert to Constantinople to deal with some issues, including the filioque dispute and other disagreements. Cardinal Humbert was, to put it mildly, not a diplomat. He was arrogant, stubborn, and had no respect for the Eastern traditions. The Patriarch of Constantinople at the time was Michael Cerularius, who was equally strong-willed and equally unwilling to back down. It was a personality clash worthy of a reality TV show. Things quickly went from bad to worse. On July 16, 1054, Cardinal Humbert, frustrated by the Patriarch's resistance, marched into the Hagia Sophia during a divine liturgy, a church service, and dramatically placed a papal bull, a decree of excommunication on the altar. An excommunication basically means kicking someone out of the church, saying they're no longer considered a true Christian. In this case, the Pope's representative was excommunicating the Patriarch of Constantinople and his followers. The Patriarch, not one to be outdone, responded in kind a few days later, publicly excommunicating Cardinal Humbert and his associates. It was like two powerful individuals saying, "You're out of the club. No, you're out of the club." This event, the mutual excommunications of 1054, is known as the Great Schism. It wasn't immediately understood as the final, irreversible break, and people hoped it might be fixed. But in reality, it marked the formal, permanent separation of the Christian Church into two main branches: the Roman Catholic Church in the West, led by the Pope, and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East, led by the Patriarch of Constantinople and other patriarchs. It was a huge, defining moment. For centuries after, these two branches of Christianity, despite sharing a common root, would develop independently, with their own unique traditions, theological understandings, and church governance. The Byzantines saw themselves as preserving the orthodox, correct, faith, while the West saw itself as the universal Catholic, universal church. The Great Schism wasn't just a religious event. It had massive political and cultural implications, too. It deepened the divide between East and West, making it harder for them to cooperate, especially when new threats emerged. It was a sad, drawn-out breakup, with centuries of accumulated grievances finally boiling over. So, as we see the two great wings of Christianity formally part ways, remember that this wasn't just about a word or two. It was the culmination of centuries of divergence in language, politics, culture, and theology. The Byzantine Empire, our Rome that refused to die, was now even more distinct, even more uniquely Eastern Orthodox. And this distinct identity would be crucial as it faced new, formidable challenges from both East and West. And that, my friends, is exactly where our story takes us next time. We saw the Christian world split into two major branches with the Great Schism, leaving the Byzantine Empire firmly rooted as the Eastern Orthodox powerhouse. While Basil II was busy cementing Byzantine control in the Balkans, a new force was stirring in the East, a force that would deal the empire a blow from which it would never fully recover. Just when you thought the Byzantines had faced every possible kind of enemy, Goths, Vandals, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars' history threw another curveball: the Seljuk Turks. Now, the Seljuk Turks were a group of nomadic warriors originally from the steppes of Central Asia. Like many nomadic peoples throughout history, they were formidable horsemen and incredibly skilled archers. They had converted to Sunni Islam and, by the 11th century, were expanding rapidly, first into Persia and then moving westward. They were fierce, disciplined, and religiously zealous, seeing themselves as defenders and expanders of the Islamic faith. They were like a well-oiled, fast-moving military machine, ready to conquer. Their expansion brought them inevitably into conflict with the Byzantine Empire, specifically in a region called Anatolia. If you look at a map, Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, was pretty much the heartland of the Byzantine Empire. It was where a lot of their soldiers came from, where a lot of their food was grown, and it was a strategic buffer protecting Constantinople itself. Losing Anatolia would be like losing your core provinces, your industrial base, and your military training grounds all at once. It was a disaster waiting to happen. The Seljuks weren't interested in just raiding and then leaving. They wanted to settle. They pushed into Byzantine territory, leading to increasing skirmishes and battles. The Byzantine emperors knew they had a serious problem on their hands. After the death of Basil II, the Macedonian dynasty slowly declined, and there wasn't another emperor quite as strong or as militarily brilliant to lead the charge. There were a lot of internal squabbles and political drama in Constantinople, which meant less focus on the growing threat at the borders. Classic imperial problem: too much palace intrigue, not enough border defense. Finally, in 1071 AD, one emperor decided he had to deal with the Seljuk threat once and for all. This was Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes. He was a military man, determined to push the Seljuks back and secure Anatolia. He gathered a massive army, a mix of professional Byzantine soldiers, various mercenary groups, including some Franks, Pecheneg, and even some Norman knights, and local levies. He marched this huge force deep into eastern Anatolia to confront the Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan. The two armies met near a place called Manzikert, and what followed was one of the most catastrophic defeats in Byzantine history: the Battle of Manzikert. Imagine the scene: two massive armies facing each other on a vast plain. The Byzantine army, once the envy of the world, was a bit disorganized, with communication issues between its diverse mercenary groups. The Seljuk army, on the other hand, was unified, highly mobile, and under the command of a brilliant leader in Alp Arslan. During the battle, things went wrong for the Byzantines. There were misunderstandings, possibly betrayals by some of the mercenary commanders, and a general lack of coordination. Romanos IV bravely led his troops, But it was not enough. The Seljuk cavalry, with their swift hit-and-run tactics and deadly archery, decimated the slower, heavier Byzantine forces. The Byzantine army was utterly routed, and, incredibly, Emperor Romanos for himself was captured by the Seljuks. Think about that. A Roman emperor captured by an enemy. It was an absolute humiliation, a massive blow to Byzantine prestige and morale. Sultan Alp Arslan treated Romanos with surprising respect, even releasing him after he promised a hefty ransom and made a treaty. However, the damage was done. When Romanos IV returned to Constantinople, he found he had been overthrown in a palace coup. The internal politics of the empire, always a bit dramatic, descended into outright civil war among various factions vying for the throne. The Battle of Manzikert itself wasn't immediately the end of the world for Byzantium in terms of land loss. The actual battle only cost a portion of the army, but its consequences were utterly devastating and long-lasting. With the main Byzantine army shattered and the empire plunged into civil war, there was no one left to defend Anatolia. The Seljuk Turks, seeing the power vacuum, poured into the region virtually unopposed. Within a few years, vast swaths of Anatolia, the agricultural and military heartland of the empire, were permanently lost to the Seljuks. They established their own sultanate there, eventually known as the Sultanate of Rum, meaning Rome, reflecting their conquest of former Roman lands. This wasn't a temporary loss. It was a permanent transformation of the Byzantine Empire's geography and power. The empire shrank dramatically, becoming a shadow of its former self, pushed back towards its coasts. Manzikert was a turning point. It signaled the beginning of the end for Byzantine dominance in the east and opened the door for new threats. The Byzantines, desperate to reclaim their lost territories and seeing the growing power of the Seljuks, began to look westward for help. They appealed to the Pope and the Latin West, hoping for military assistance. Little did they know, this plea for help would set in motion a chain of events that would bring a whole new set of problems from within the Christian world itself, leading to even more complex and, at times, tragic interactions with Western Europe. And that, my friends, is where our story heads next time, into the turbulent age of the Crusades. We talked about how the Byzantines, desperate for help against the Seljuk Turks, appealed to the West, which led to the start of the Crusades. We learned that the relationship between the proud, sophisticated Byzantines and the rough-and-tumble Western Crusaders was, to put it mildly, complicated. There was a whole lot of mistrust, misunderstanding, and eye-rolling on both sides. But all that simmering tension was about to boil over in the most spectacular and devastating way imaginable. Today, we're going to talk about an event so shocking, so utterly counterintuitive, that it still makes historians scratch their heads and sigh. The Fourth Crusade. This was supposed to be a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. Instead, it ended up attacking and sacking the largest Christian city in the world, Constantinople itself. Yes, you heard that right. Fellow Christians attacked fellow Christians, and it was a disaster of epic proportions for our Rome that refused to die. So, how did this colossal mess happen? Well, it's a bit of a tangled tale, a mix of bad decisions, greed, political maneuvering, and that deep-seated mistrust we talked about. The Fourth Crusade set out from Western Europe around 1202 AD, aiming for Egypt, hoping to then use it as a base to retake Jerusalem. But these crusaders were having a little problem. They were broke. They needed ships to get to Egypt, and they had contracted with the Venetians, who were basically the seafaring capitalists of the day, to provide a massive fleet. Only problem? The Crusaders couldn't pay the full amount. The Venetians, being shrewd businessmen, weren't about to let a debt go unpaid. Their leader, the incredibly cunning and elderly Doge Enrico Dandolo, he was blind, but apparently had the vision of a hawk when it came to making deals, proposed a solution. Help us capture the city of Zara, a Christian city that used to be Venetian but was now controlled by Hungary, and we'll defer your debt. The Crusaders, desperate, agreed, attacking a Christian city for money, even before they got to the Holy Land? Yeah, the red flags were flying high already. The Pope was furious and excommunicated them, but that didn't stop them. After Zara, things got even weirder. A Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos showed up. He was the son of a deposed Byzantine emperor and promised the Crusaders immense wealth, military aid, and even the healing of the Great Schism. Remember that big religious breakup? If they would just help him put his father back on the throne in Constantinople. Now pause for a moment. Think about this. These Crusaders were supposed to be going to Jerusalem, but here they were already diverted to attack one Christian city, and now being offered a deal to divert again to attack another Christian city, the greatest Christian city in the world, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The arguments among the Crusaders must have been epic. Many probably knew this was morally wrong, but the lure of Byzantine gold and the promise of a unified church were too tempting for others. Plus, they still owed the Venetians a lot of money. The idea of attacking Constantinople became a twisted kind of financial solution. So, in 1203 AD, the Fourth Crusade arrived at the majestic walls of Constantinople. The Byzantines, who had seen Crusaders pass through before, were absolutely stunned. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be fighting Muslims. Not us, but the Crusaders, with Venetian ships, besieged the city. They managed to break through the defenses, and Alexios Angelos was indeed placed on the throne as Alexios IV. However, the new emperor quickly found he couldn't pay the Crusaders all the incredible riches he'd promised. The Byzantine people were hostile to these Westerners, who were often rude and disrespectful, and didn't want their treasury emptied for them. Tensions rose, a revolt broke out in Constantinople. Alexios IV was overthrown and killed, and the Crusaders were left feeling cheated and angry, stuck outside the city again. And that's when it happened. In April 1204 AD, the Crusaders decided, forget Jerusalem, forget the Holy Land. We're taking Constantinople for ourselves. They launched a full-scale assault on the city, breaching its formidable walls, this time using ladders from their Venetian ships to scale the seawalls. What followed was one of the most shameful and brutal sacks in history. For 3 horrific days, the Crusaders looted, murdered, and desecrated Constantinople. They plundered churches, stole priceless relics, melted down magnificent bronze statues, and destroyed countless works of art and literature. The great Hagia Sophia was desecrated, its altar smashed, its treasures stolen. Nuns were raped, citizens were slaughtered in the streets. Imagine the most beautiful, civilized, and ancient city in the Christian world, brutally violated by its supposed allies. It was a betrayal of truly biblical proportions. The wealth they stole was immense, and much of it ended up back in Venice and other Western European cities. The famous bronze horses that adorn St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, stolen from Constantinople. Countless holy relics that Western churches proudly display. Many were looted from Byzantine churches during this sack. The devastation was not just material. It was psychological and spiritual. The relationship between Eastern and Western Christianity, already strained by the Great Schism, was utterly shattered. The Byzantines never forgot this betrayal. How could they? The Crusaders, supposedly fighting for God, had destroyed the very heart of the Eastern Christian world. The immediate result was the end of the Byzantine Empire, for a while anyway. The Crusaders established the so-called Latin Empire in Constantinople, ruling over fragmented Byzantine territories for about 57 years. The Byzantine people fled and set up smaller successor states in places like Nicaea and Trebizond, clinging to the hope of one day reclaiming their capital. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was a catastrophic blow. It fundamentally weakened the Byzantine Empire, making it much easier prey for future enemies. It was a wound that never truly healed, a betrayal that echoed through centuries. And it stands as a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest threats can come from those you least expect, or perhaps those you were forced to call allies. As we consider the smoldering ruins and shattered dreams of Constantinople after this horrific event, remember that our Rome that refused to die was brought to its knees, not by Muslim invaders, but by fellow Christians. But even then, the story wasn't quite over. The Byzantines, ever resilient, would find a way to reclaim their capital, though it would be a shadow of its former glory. We witnessed the absolute catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade and the brutal sack of Constantinople in 1204. It was a truly heartbreaking moment, when the shining city, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, was conquered and plundered by fellow Christians. For the first time in nearly 9 centuries, Constantinople was not in Roman hands. It was taken over by a new Latin empire run by Western European crusaders. Our Rome that refused to die seemed to have finally, tragically, breathed its last. But if you've been paying attention to this story, you know that the Byzantines are ridiculously resilient. They don't just give up that easily. While Constantinople itself was occupied by the Latins, the Byzantine spirit, the Byzantine government, and the Byzantine identity didn't simply vanish. Oh no, they went into exile. Imagine the situation. The capital city is gone, occupied by foreigners who don't understand your language, your religion, or your customs. Many of the Byzantine nobles, scholars, and ordinary people fled the city. But instead of just dissolving, they regrouped in various parts of the former empire that the Latins hadn't managed to conquer fully. Several smaller Byzantine successor states popped up, like little pockets of resistance, each claiming to be the true heir to the Roman Empire. The most important and ultimately successful of these successor states was the Empire of Nicaea. Nicaea was a city in western Anatolia, and it became the new center of Byzantine power, culture, and resistance. It was like the Byzantine government decided, okay, new temporary office space, same great empire, just a different address for a bit. They set up their own imperial court, their own church hierarchy, and continued to operate as if Constantinople would one day be theirs again. The emperors of Nicaea were incredibly determined. They saw it as their sacred duty to eventually reclaim Constantinople and restore the true Roman Empire. They fought against the Latin Empire, against other rival Byzantine states, because of course there was always some internal squabbling, and against various Turkish groups who were still nibbling at their borders. They slowly but surely built up their strength, their armies, and their prestige. Life in Nicaea wasn't as grand as it had been in Constantinople. It was a smaller, more provincial city, but it became a beacon of hope for Byzantines everywhere. Scholars continued to study, churches continued to preach Orthodox Christianity, and the dream of restoration burned brightly. It was a remarkable testament to the strength of their imperial and religious identity. They refused to let their culture be erased. Then, around the mid-13th century, a new figure emerged who would lead the charge for restoration: Michael VIII Palaiologos. Now, Michael was a cunning, ambitious, and politically savvy general and nobleman. He managed to outmaneuver his rivals within the Nicaean Empire, eventually becoming emperor. He was a man who knew how to play the game, both on the battlefield and in the palace. He had one overriding goal: to take back Constantinople. By this point, the Latin Empire in Constantinople was frankly a bit of a mess. It was always struggling financially, constantly begging for money and support from Western Europe. Its rulers were often ineffective, and the Byzantine population within the city still resented their foreign overlords. The Latin Empire was like a castle built on sand, constantly shifting and vulnerable. The moment for Michael VIII came in 1261 AD. He sent his general, Alexios Strategopoulos, with a relatively small force to scout around Constantinople. This general, through a stroke of incredible luck, found that the Latin garrison defending the city was almost entirely absent, having gone off to attack a nearby Byzantine island. Alexios Strategopoulos saw his chance. With the help of some local Byzantines who showed them a secret way into the city, his troops slipped in almost undetected. They surprised the few Latin guards, quickly took control of the main gates, and then threw them open. When the Latin emperor heard that the Byzantines were inside the city, he and his court panicked and fled on Venetian ships, leaving Constantinople virtually unopposed. It was an almost bloodless reconquest, a quiet return rather than a grand, dramatic battle. On August 15, 1261, Michael VIII Palaiologos triumphantly entered Constantinople and was crowned emperor in the Hagia Sophia. The Byzantine Empire was restored. The capital was back in Byzantine hands. Imagine the joyous celebrations, the ringing of church bells, the overwhelming sense of relief and pride after 57 long years of exile. It was a moment of immense triumph, a testament to their enduring spirit. However, the empire that Michael VIII restored was a shadow of its former self. Constantinople itself was still scarred from the sack of 1204. Many of its grand buildings were ruined, its population had shrunk, and its wealth was gone. The empire was much smaller, surrounded by enemies on all sides. The Seljuk Turks in Anatolia, new powerful Balkan states, and the ever-present rivalry with Venice and Genoa, the Italian maritime republics, who saw the Byzantines as economic competitors. The restored Byzantine Empire was like an old, beloved book, rescued from a fire. It was still there, the stories still inside, but it was damaged, its pages singed, its covers worn. Michael VIII had achieved his goal, but he inherited a fragile state, constantly battling for survival. The Rome that refused to die had indeed come back to life, but it was now much weaker, entering its long twilight years, facing its greatest and final threat. And that, my friends, is where our story will tragically lead us next. We rejoiced with the Byzantines as Michael VIII Palaiologos miraculously reclaimed Constantinople from the Latins in 1261. The empire was restored. Hooray! But we also hinted that this wasn't the triumphant return to glory that everyone had hoped for. The empire was like a severely injured patient who had just left the emergency room stable, but still incredibly weak and vulnerable. And unfortunately, a new, even more formidable, and ultimately unstoppable force was about to appear on the horizon: the Ottoman Turks. Remember those Seljuk Turks who dealt the Byzantines a huge blow at Manzikert and took over most of Anatolia? Well, the Seljuk Sultanate eventually started to break up into smaller, independent Turkish emirates, small states. One of these emirates, located in northwestern Anatolia, was led by a man named Osman. And from this small beginning, a dynasty and an empire would rise that would change the world: the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were, to put it simply, incredibly good at what they did. They were brilliant warriors, highly organized, and strategically clever. They adopted new military technologies like gunpowder and powerful cannons very early on, and they were driven by a strong sense of religious zeal, seeing themselves as Ghazis, warriors for the Islamic faith, expanding its borders. They were like a well-oiled, constantly improving, conquering machine. The restored Byzantine Empire, on the other hand, was struggling. It was economically weak, its army was small and often reliant on mercenaries, and it was constantly embroiled in civil wars and succession disputes among its own nobility. The imperial family, the Palaiologoi, spent a lot of time fighting amongst themselves, which wasn't exactly helpful when a massive new threat was growing right on their doorstep. It was like trying to fix a leaky boat while everyone inside is arguing about who gets to steer. So, while the Byzantines squabbled, the Ottomans steadily grew in power. They gradually conquered the remaining Byzantine territories in Anatolia, one fortress, one city at a time. It was like a slow-motion avalanche, inexorably rolling down the mountain. By the mid-14th century, the Ottomans had not only taken most of Byzantine Asia Minor, but they had also crossed into Europe, establishing a foothold in the Balkans. This was a massive strategic shift. The empire that had once been the protector of Europe was now watching its own backyard being taken over. Constantinople, once the queen of cities, was gradually becoming an isolated island in a sea of Ottoman territory. It was still formidable, still had its incredible walls, but its surrounding lands were gone. It was like a magnificent, besieged castle with no kingdom left to support it. The population dwindled, trade declined, and the city became poorer and more desperate. The Byzantine emperors, now ruling over little more than Constantinople and a few scattered territories, realized their desperate situation. They made repeated, frantic appeals to Western Europe for help. "Please," they cried, "help us fight the Ottomans. They are a threat to all of Christendom." But these pleas largely fell on deaf ears. Western Europe was busy with its own problems, like the 100 Years' War between England and France, and the Black Death, which had devastated their populations. And there was still that deep, bitter resentment from the Great Schism and, even more so, the Fourth Crusade. Many in the West still saw the Byzantines as schismatics, heretics who refused to acknowledge the Pope's authority. Why should we help them? Some probably thought. They brought it on themselves. Sometimes, offers of help came with a heavy price. the Byzantines would have to formally accept the Pope's supremacy and unite their church with Rome. Desperate, some emperors agreed to these terms, even traveling to Italy to make a show of unity. But these forced unions were deeply unpopular back home in Constantinople, where the Orthodox clergy and common people often preferred the Sultan's turban to the cardinal's hat, meaning they'd rather be ruled by Muslims than by Western Catholics who had betrayed them. So the Byzantines were caught in an impossible bind. They needed help, but the only people who could offer it were the ones they deeply mistrusted and who demanded compromises they couldn't truly make. As the 15th century dawned, the Ottoman Empire had consolidated its power, conquered much of the Balkans, and completely surrounded Constantinople. It was no longer a question of if the city would fall, but when. The stage was set for the final tragic act. The last Byzantine emperor was Constantine XI Palaiologos. He was a brave, dignified, and determined man, worthy of his namesake, the founder of Constantinople. He knew the end was near, but he was resolved to fight to the very last. He refused to abandon his city, even when offered safe passage by the Ottoman Sultan. He was going to stand with his people in the last bastion of the Roman Empire, come what may. He truly embodied the spirit of the Rome that refused to die, even if it meant dying with it. As the ominous Ottoman tide gathered around the ancient walls of Constantinople, a sense of grim finality settled over the city. The thousand-year story of forgotten glory was approaching its heartbreaking conclusion. And that, my friends, is the tale we must face next. The epic, tragic fall of Constantinople. We've journeyed over 1,000 years with our Rome that refused to die. We've seen it rise, fall, rebuild, and face down countless enemies. We've marveled at its wonders and winced at its internal squabbles. Now we arrive at the final, heartbreaking chapter of its incredible story. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD. Last time, we left Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the very last Byzantine emperor, bravely determined to stand with his city, even as the mighty Ottoman Empire gathered its forces all around him. The writing was on the wall, literally and figuratively. Constantinople, once the greatest city in the world, was now a lonely outpost, a Christian island in a vast Ottoman sea. Leading the Ottoman forces was a young, incredibly ambitious, and brilliant sultan named Mehmed II. He was only 21 years old, but he was a strategic genius, utterly determined to conquer Constantinople. For him, taking the city wasn't just about expanding his empire. It was about fulfilling ancient prophecies and securing his place in history. He was known as the Conqueror, and he truly lived up to that name. In April 1453, Mehmed II arrived outside Constantinople with an absolutely enormous army. Estimates range from 80,000 to 150,000 soldiers, maybe even more. To put that in perspective, the entire population of Constantinople at the time was probably only around 50,000 people, and only about 7,000 to 10,000 of those were actual defenders, a mix of Byzantine soldiers, foreign mercenaries, including some very brave Genoese and Venetian volunteers, and ordinary citizens. The odds were, to say the least, stacked against the Byzantines. It was like a tiny, valiant mouse facing a colossal, hungry cat. Mehmed II also brought with him the latest, most terrifying weapon of the age: massive cannons. He had a giant cannon, nicknamed the Basilic, cast specifically for this siege. This thing was enormous, capable of firing huge stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. The famous Theodosian walls of Constantinople, which had stood unconquered for over 1,000 years against Goths, Huns, Avars, Persians, and Arabs, were finally facing their biggest challenge. The siege lasted for 53 agonizing days. Day after day, the Ottomans bombarded the walls with their massive cannons, creating breaches. Day after day, the Byzantines, led by Emperor Constantine XI, desperately fought to repair the damage, often at night, under the cover of darkness. The defenders fought with incredible bravery, knowing that if the city fell, they would likely face slaughter or enslavement. There were moments of both heroism and despair. The Ottoman fleet, far outnumbering the Byzantine and Allied ships, tried to break through the Golden Horn, the city's main harbor. But the Byzantines had famously stretched a huge, heavy chain across the harbor entrance, preventing ships from entering. Mehmed II, being the genius he was, came up with an audacious solution. He had his ships hauled overland on grease logs around the Genoese colony of Galata and then relaunched them into the Golden Horn behind the chain. Imagine the defenders' shock when they woke up one morning to find Ottoman ships inside their supposedly impenetrable harbor. It was a brilliant, jaw-dropping maneuver. As the siege dragged on, food became scarce and fatigue set in. The small number of defenders was stretched to its absolute limit. Emperor Constantine XI tirelessly led by example, fighting alongside his men on the walls, encouraging everyone. He had refused to abandon his city, and he was ready to die defending it. Finally, on May 29, 1453, Sultan Mehmed II launched his final, all-out assault. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers crashed against the battered walls. The fighting was ferocious, hand-to-hand, desperate. The defenders, exhausted but still defiant, held their ground against overwhelming numbers. The critical moment came when a small postern gate, a hidden door, in the walls called the Kirkaporta, was accidentally left unlocked. A small group of Ottoman soldiers managed to get inside, raise their flag, and create a diversion. At the same time, the emperor and his men were fighting valiantly at another breach, but as more Ottoman soldiers poured through the main breaches, the defense finally collapsed. Emperor Constantine XI, seeing that all was lost, reportedly stripped off his imperial insignia, so he wouldn't be recognized and captured, and charged into the thickest part of the fighting with his remaining soldiers. He died a hero's death, fighting for his city until the very end. He was the last Roman emperor, bringing to a close a continuous line of emperors that stretched back to Augustus, and even further to Julius Caesar and the Roman Republic. With the emperor fallen and the defenses breached, the city was overrun. What followed was a period of horrific looting, violence, and destruction by the victorious Ottoman army, as was customary for cities that resisted conquest. The great Hagia Sophia, which had stood as a Christian cathedral for over 1,000 years, was converted into a mosque. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was more than just the end of a city or an empire. It was a monumental turning point in world history. It marked the definitive end of the Roman Empire, 2,206 years after its legendary founding. It signaled the end of the Middle Ages for many historians and the beginning of the early modern era. It opened up new trade routes, encouraged European exploration, and sent a wave of Byzantine scholars and their classical Greek texts fleeing to the West, which helped fuel the Renaissance in Italy. The Rome that refused to die had finally fallen, but its impact, its legacy, was far from over. Even in its defeat, it reshaped the world. And that, my friends, is a powerful legacy, one that echoes even today. And so, the incredible 1,000-year journey of the Byzantine Empire comes to an end. A story of forgotten glory, of resilience, of beauty, and of the Rome that truly refused to die until it simply couldn't fight anymore. Now, as the echoes of its long history fade, it's time for you to drift off. Close your eyes, let the story settle, and rest deeply. Good night.